Hello YouTube, and welcome to the explanation for the first of Gascoignes' memories. As usual, I'm just going to go through the text, and every idea I'm going to explain words that are not in the common vocabulary these days, and the overall meaning idea by idea. And then once I've uploaded all of these specific and discrete textual description videos, I'll have a larger discussion video that talks about all of them and the bigger themes and deeper significances of them. So here we go. If yielding fear or cankered villainy in Caesar's haughty heart had ta'en the charge, the walls of Rome had not been reared so high, nor yet the mighty empire left so large. The general sense of these lines is, of course, if Caesar had given in to fear, then the walls of Rome wouldn't have been built so high and mighty. The empire wouldn't have been so large. The only word here that might be a little confusing is cankered, which means something like festering or corrupted or cancerous. It's the root from which, or a shared root at least, with the word cancerous. If Menelaus could have ruled his will with foul reproach to lose his fair delight, then had the stately towers of Troy stood still, and Greeks with grudge had drunk their own despite. So if Menelaus could have controlled himself with foul reproach to lose his fair delight, so if he could have restrained himself when he lost Helen to Paris, then Troy would not have been destroyed, and the Greeks would have drunk their own despite. So he's presenting this along with the previous lines about Caesar. He's presenting this as a bad thing. If Menelaus had not gone to Troy and destroyed it, it would have been bad for the Greeks. So in this case, it would have been bad for Menelaus if he had controlled his will. An interesting approach here. If dread of drenching waves or fear of fire had stayed the wandering prince amid his race, Ascanius then, the fruit of his desire, in Lavine land had not possessed place. And of course this is alluding to Aeneas and his son Ascanius, saying that if Aeneas were afraid of traveling the seas and had a fear of fire. There's several instances where fire is important in the Aeneid. For example, Dido on her pyre. There's the attempt to burn the ships at one point. So if he had been afraid, then Ascanius, who is the fruit of his desires, the continuation of his line, Ascanius would not have possessed place in Lavine lands being, eventually Rome, the land of Lavinia. But true it is, where lots do light by chance, their fortune helps the boldest to advance. So he's saying overall that fear gets in the way of greatness. It's true, as he says, where lots do light by chance, so where you happen to get a good lot, their fortune helps the boldest to advance. So it's not just avoiding fear. There's also a certain element of chance that you have no control over. It comes from fortune, and it's up to fortune to determine whether or not you will succeed. But he's saying you certainly cannot succeed without courage. And then you may or may not succeed because fortune may or may not be with you. So here we have an interesting poem just looking in and of itself. This is showing off Gascoignes' knowledge of classical literature. All students of Latin around the time that Gascoigne was learning Latin, and in the modern day as well, I think to a certain extent, students who learn Latin will go to Caesar's writings relatively quickly and start translating those and, learning them through that process. And then, of course, the Aeneid is another text that students of Latin will learn relatively quickly. And students studying Greek at this time would have studied the Iliad for their Greek. And the Iliad is in some ways not a great text to study for Greek because it has, if I'm remembering correctly, something like this number is probably not going to be accurate, but somewhere around like 4,000 words that are only used once in the text, which is kind of mind-boggling considering how long the text is and how many topics are present. But in any case, this is showing off his learning, which of course he would want to do as he's entering into legal study and being asked by his friends. The very purpose of these poems is to show that he was fit to be a part of this group of fellow students. And so he has to show off his learning. And he's not only showing off his learning of classical texts and therefore literature and also Latin and Greek by implication, since at this point, there aren't any English translations of these texts that are commercially available. That will happen relatively soon in the late 16th century, and there are a number of translations then in the 17th century. But at the time that he is entering into Gray's Inn to study law, none of those texts would be available in English commercially, as I said. It's possible you could get a translation from someone, but you would have already learned Latin and Greek on your own, so there would be no reason to get a translation from someone unless you were trying to make people think you knew how to read Latin and Greek when you actually didn't. So he shows off his ability there. He also shows off his ability to write poetry in the process of writing this poetry. And he shows off one other aspect, which I'm going to talk about more in the longer video about the whole thing and the broader context and all that. He talks about virtue. And the first virtue he chooses is courage. And that's really interesting because he has to be courageous in order to enter into this challenge. And when embarking on a new phase of your life at any point, you have to be courageous. But he's also showing off his education in virtue by describing this particular virtue and describing it in a way that would be deemed as correct by those individuals that he's interacting with. So he's showing off all kinds of education just by writing poems. It's a beautiful representation of what culture was like in the 16th century in early modern England and the early modern European world in general, and really points out that sad fact of the modern day that we live in a post-poetic world. But it's never too late to write poetry and revive a beautiful, rich art form like that. Anyway, that's everything for this first very short poem, and you'll see the next video for the second poem relatively soon. I hope you're having a good day, and I hope you enjoyed the video.